Listen carefully, because what you are about to hear is not simply a story about love. It is about a moment when someone tried to make a decision for your person, and discovered that the heart cannot always be commanded to move on. Someone sat across from the person you love and said words that sounded reasonable on the surface. Why are you still thinking about them? Forget them. It is time to get married and start a new life. The pressure was real. The advice did not come from a stranger passing by. It came from someone who believed they knew what was best. They presented another path, another person, another future. They spoke as though the chapter involving you had already ended. But then something happened that nobody expected. Your person did not give the answer everyone was waiting for. And the response that came from their heart changed the entire conversation. So do not rush away from this message, because the deeper truth is not only about what someone asked them to do. It is about what happened inside them when they were told to erase a connection that had never truly disappeared. For a long time, your person tried to look normal on the outside. They continued with responsibilities. They spoke with people. They laughed when the situation required it. They may even have convinced others that they had completely moved beyond what happened between the two of you. Yet there is a difference between moving forward with life and forgetting someone who once reached a hidden place in your heart. That is the part nobody around them fully understood. The person giving this advice assumed that time had removed you from their thoughts. They believed silence meant closure. They mistook distance for emotional freedom. But silence does not always mean someone has stopped caring. Sometimes silence is where the deepest questions are living. And when your person was told to forget you and agree to marry someone else, those questions suddenly became impossible to ignore. At first, they may have stayed quiet. Not because they agreed. Because the words touched something sensitive. Imagine being told that you must close a door before you are certain you have finished looking through it. Imagine being asked to promise your future to someone while a part of your heart is still trying to understand another connection. That is why the room became emotionally complicated. Your person looked at the situation differently than before. They realized that other people could suggest a future, arrange possibilities, and tell them what choice would be easiest, but nobody else could feel what they felt. The conversation continued. Life is moving on. You cannot wait forever. You should choose someone who is available. Why hold on to something uncertain? Those questions may have sounded logical. And perhaps, for a moment, your person even wondered whether everyone else was right. Maybe they asked themselves whether it would be easier to simply say yes. Maybe they considered what life would look like if they stopped resisting the pressure. Maybe they thought that choosing another person would finally bring peace. But then your memory appeared where they least expected it. Not as a dramatic fantasy. Not as a perfect movie scene. It came through something small. A sentence they remembered. A habit that reminded them of you. A song. A place. A certain kind of silence. And suddenly they understood that forgetting is not something another person can order you to do. You can decide to stop speaking. You can hide photographs. You can change routines. You can avoid places. But you cannot always convince the heart that what mattered never mattered. That realization frightened them because it meant they could no longer pretend that the decision was simple. And this is where the entire story changed. The person asking them to marry believed the answer would come quickly. They expected your person to say, "Yes, you are right. I need to forget the past." Instead, your person hesitated. That hesitation spoke louder than anyone expected. Because sometimes a pause is where the truth begins to reveal itself. They may not have used the exact words anyone imagined, but the meaning was clear. How can I make a lifetime decision when I am still carrying unanswered feelings? The room changed. The conversation stopped being about finding the right match or meeting the right expectations. It became about honesty. Your person realized that marrying someone simply to prove they had moved on would be unfair, not only to themselves, but also to the other person involved. That was a major turning point. They could have accepted the easiest answer. They could have allowed family expectations, social pressure, loneliness, or fear of the future to make the decision. Instead, something inside them asked a difficult question. What if I am not as over this as I have been pretending to be? And when that question appeared, everything else had to wait. Because the truth is, a new commitment cannot automatically heal an old wound. A marriage cannot be used as a bandage. A new person cannot be forced to carry the responsibility of making you forget someone else. Your person began to understand this. The advice continued. People may have reminded them of age, timing, family, opportunities, and expectations. They may have heard every possible reason why they should stop looking backward. But the more they were told to forget you, the more honestly they had to confront what you meant to them. Isn't it strange how people sometimes reveal what matters most by telling us to let it go? Before that conversation, your person may have pushed their feelings into the background. They had learned to survive without confronting everything. But being directly told, forget them, brought your name back to the center of their thoughts. They remembered the moments that had seemed ordinary at the time but later became meaningful. They remembered what they never said. They remembered misunderstandings. They remembered the things they wished they had handled differently. And perhaps, most painfully, they remembered that there were questions between you that had never received a real answer. This is what changed everything. Your person stopped seeing you as merely a chapter from the past. They began to ask whether the story had truly reached its ending. Now, understand something important. Remembering someone does not automatically mean every relationship is meant to return exactly as it was. Real love requires honesty, communication, maturity, and mutual choice. But this message is about the power of emotional truth. Your person could no longer deny that a decision as serious as marriage required clarity. They could not simply walk toward an altar while carrying someone else silently in their heart. So finally, the response came. Perhaps quietly. Perhaps with emotion. Perhaps after a long silence that made everyone uncomfortable. But the message was something like this. I cannot promise my life to another person just because people are tired of waiting for me to understand my own heart. And nobody expected that. The person who had been pushing them was surprised. They may have asked, "Are you still thinking about them?" Your person could have denied it. That would have been easier. But instead, they faced the truth. Yes. That single acknowledgement changed the direction of everything. Because once the truth was spoken, pretending became much harder. For so long, your person may have believed that admitting their feelings would make them weak. They thought that moving on meant never mentioning you again. But there is strength in emotional honesty. There is courage in saying, I do not have all the answers yet. There is wisdom in refusing to make a permanent decision while your heart is confused. And there is maturity in recognizing that another human being deserves more than half of your attention and a heart divided by unresolved memories. That day, your person began to see themselves differently. They understood that people could judge their choices without knowing their private struggles. Someone could tell them, you should be over this by now, without understanding what truly happened. Others could simplify your connection because they never lived it. But your person lived it. They knew the impact. They knew the emotions. And they knew there was something they still needed to face before moving into a completely different future. After the conversation ended, your person was left alone with their thoughts. And that is when the real transformation began. No audience. No advice. No one telling them what answer would be correct. Just them, and the truth they had avoided. They began to ask themselves questions they had postponed for a long time. Why does this still affect me? What do I actually miss? Was I hurt, or was I afraid? Did I leave things unfinished? Have I been waiting for a sign instead of having the courage to communicate? These questions were uncomfortable, but they were necessary. Sometimes life changes when we stop asking what everyone expects from us and start asking what honesty requires from us. Your person realized that forgetting you was not a switch they could simply turn off. But more importantly, they realized that holding onto a memory was not enough either. They needed understanding. They needed clarity. They needed to know whether their feelings were connected to the past, to regret, to genuine love, or to words that had never been spoken. And that is why their response changed everything. Because until that moment, the future had been moving according to other people's expectations. After that moment, your person began taking emotional responsibility for their own life. They stopped letting fear make every decision. They stopped believing that being pressured was the same as being ready. And somewhere in the middle of all those thoughts, you became impossible to ignore. Not because they suddenly idealized you, but because they began to see the connection with greater honesty. They remembered your humanity, your strengths, your imperfections, the misunderstandings, the good moments, the complicated moments. They no longer wanted to view the story through anger alone or nostalgia alone. They wanted the truth. That is a much deeper place than simple longing. And perhaps that is why they have been different lately. Something has shifted inside them. The person who once avoided certain thoughts may now find themselves returning to them. The one who tried to stay distracted may suddenly feel quiet. They may be comparing the life others recommend with the life their heart actually desires. And every time someone tells them that they should simply forget you, they are reminded that emotions do not always obey a schedule. Yet this story becomes even more powerful. Because the person who suggested marriage may have believed they were offering a solution. They thought a new beginning would erase the old one. But your person's reaction showed that a true beginning must be chosen freely. Not out of fear. Not because of loneliness. Not because relatives are asking questions. Not because time is passing. Not because someone says, "This is what you should do." Marriage is too important to become an escape route. Your person understood that more clearly than ever before. And suddenly, the people around them began seeing something different. They saw that your person was not simply being difficult. There was something unresolved. Something genuine needed to be understood. The pressure began to lose its power because your person finally drew an emotional boundary. They essentially said, "Please stop asking me to make a decision before I am ready to live with the consequences of it." That changed the atmosphere. Because for the first time, they were speaking from their own heart rather than trying to satisfy everyone else's expectations. Now imagine what happened after that conversation. Your name stayed with them. They may have tried to continue with the day, but something inside had already awakened. A simple instruction, "Forget them," had forced them to remember why they could not. And that led them back to the moments they had buried. Maybe they remembered the last conversation you had. Maybe they replayed a moment when they could have been more honest. Maybe they wondered whether you ever understood how deeply something affected them. Maybe they questioned whether you had moved on completely. And perhaps the biggest question of all appeared. If I still feel this much, why did I allow silence to become the final answer? That question has power. Because silence can protect us temporarily, but it rarely explains the truth. Your person may now be realizing that they have been waiting for certainty to appear before taking any emotional risk. But certainty does not always arrive first. Sometimes honesty must come before certainty. Sometimes two people need a real conversation before they can understand what the future is supposed to be. And sometimes the answer is not what either person expected. But at least it is real. That is the difference between living with truth and living with assumptions. Your person has reached a place where assumptions are no longer enough. They cannot marry someone else merely because people assume that is what they should want. They cannot forget you merely because someone says your story is over. And they cannot continue pretending that nothing remains unresolved. So their response changed everything because it opened a door that had been closed only from the outside. Inside, the feelings had never been fully understood. Now, do not misunderstand the message. This is not a reason to stop living your own life while waiting for someone else to decide. You deserve your own peace. You deserve clarity as well. You should not lose yourself trying to predict every thought in another person's mind. The most powerful thing you can do is remain connected to your own truth. Heal what hurt you. Learn from what happened. Become stronger. Let love be something that adds to your life, not something that completely takes over your identity. If a meaningful conversation is meant to happen, it should be based on honesty from both sides. If reconciliation ever becomes possible, it must involve real growth, not simply repeating the same cycle. And if life leads in another direction, emotional clarity will still protect your heart. That is why this moment matters so much. Your person's response was not merely, "I cannot forget them." It represented something deeper. They finally refused to lie to themselves. And when someone stops lying to themselves, their life begins to change. Afterward, they may have noticed how much effort they had spent trying to appear unaffected. They may have realized that pretending to be fine had become exhausting. They may have understood that being emotionally honest does not mean abandoning wisdom. It means acknowledging reality before making decisions that affect the rest of your life. Perhaps the person pressuring them was shocked. They may have thought they understood your person's heart better than your person understood it themselves. But nobody can make a deeply personal choice for another adult. Advice can be valuable. Family can care. Friends can have good intentions. Yet at the end of the day, the person entering a marriage must live that life. And your person knew this. That realization gave them strength. For the first time, the pressure did not control the conversation. They did. And perhaps after speaking their truth, they felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because every question had been answered. But because they no longer had to pretend the questions did not exist. That is where healing often begins. Not with a perfect answer. With an honest question. Your person may now be standing between what others expect and what their heart still needs to understand. It is not an easy place. But it is a truthful place. And truth has a way of eventually revealing what confusion tried to hide. Maybe this connection will lead to a conversation. Maybe there are apologies that need to be given. Maybe there are things both of you misunderstood. Maybe life will reveal that what you felt was important but not meant to become a permanent relationship. Or maybe two people who once lost their way will discover that growth has prepared them to speak differently this time. No one can responsibly promise the exact outcome. But one thing is clear. A future built on pretending would not have been the right future for your person. That is why their response mattered. They chose not to use marriage as a way to run from their own emotions. They chose to pause instead of making a promise they were not ready to make. And sometimes a pause is the bravest response possible. Think about how different this is from what people expected. They expected them to forget you. They expected them to agree. They expected the story to close quietly. Instead, the conversation awakened something. Your person was forced to confront the possibility that they had not forgotten you because a part of them still needed truth. That truth might be about love. It might be about regret. It might be about closure. But whatever it is, they can no longer ignore it. And this is where you must also listen carefully. Do not let another person's inner journey become an excuse for you to abandon your own. While they discover what they truly want, continue becoming the strongest version of yourself. Do not chase what is unclear. Do not beg to be chosen. Do not reduce your value because someone else is confused. Real love should eventually become visible through honesty, respect, and meaningful action. Your person may have had an emotional awakening, but their next steps will reveal what that awakening truly means. Words matter. Choices matter more. A response can change a conversation, but consistent behavior changes a life. So if this message resonates with your situation, remember your worth. You are not someone who should be forgotten on command. But you are also not someone who should remain trapped inside an endless waiting room. The right kind of connection brings greater truth, not greater confusion forever. Perhaps that is the biggest transformation happening here. Your person is beginning to understand that avoiding the truth does not create peace. Choosing someone else before being emotionally ready does not guarantee happiness. And forgetting a person without understanding why they still matter only pushes the questions deeper. The conversation changed everything because it exposed what was beneath the surface. The pressure said, "Move on." Their heart said, "Wait." The world said, "Choose now." Something inside them said, "Understand first." And that inner voice became impossible to silence. After all, how could they promise forever to someone else when they had not been honest about what remained unresolved within themselves? That realization stayed with them. Perhaps late at night. Perhaps during a quiet moment when nobody was watching. Perhaps while seeing something ordinary that unexpectedly reminded them of you. And little by little, they began understanding that your story was not something they could simply erase because another person found it inconvenient. Your person had to make peace with the truth. They had to understand what they felt. They had to decide what kind of future they wanted, not the future chosen for them by pressure, fear, or expectations. That is why their response changed everything. It gave them permission to stop running from their own heart. It gave them the courage to admit that some decisions require time. And it reminded them that a meaningful life cannot be built by constantly ignoring what is true. For you, the message is equally powerful. Whatever happens next, let it come from a place of dignity. If communication opens, choose honesty. If someone reaches out, listen to actions as carefully as you listen to words. If reconciliation is possible, do not return to the past blindly. Create something healthier than what existed before. And if life takes you somewhere unexpected, trust that emotional truth can still lead you toward peace. Because the real victory is not forcing someone to choose you. The real victory is never needing to abandon yourself in order to be loved. So remember this story. Someone looked at your person and said, "Forget them. It is time to get married." They expected a simple agreement. Instead, your person had to face the truth. They realized that you cannot erase a meaningful chapter merely because others have decided it should be finished. You cannot promise your future while denying your present emotions. And you cannot build something real on top of a lie. Their response did not necessarily solve every question. but it changed the direction of their heart. For once, they stopped allowing others to decide when their feelings should end. For once, they admitted that something needed to be understood. For once, they chose honesty over appearance. And sometimes, that is the moment everything begins to change. Maybe the next chapter will come through a conversation. Maybe through an unexpected message. Maybe through the courage to finally say what was left unsaid. Or maybe through two people finding peace with the truth, whatever that truth ultimately becomes. But one thing has already shifted. The story can no longer be controlled by pretending. And that is why the person who asked your person to forget you received an answer they never expected. Your person was not ready to replace an unresolved connection simply to make everyone else comfortable. They finally understood that their heart deserved honesty, and so did every person whose future might be affected by their decision. That response changed everything. Not because it guaranteed a particular ending, but because it opened the door to something far more valuable than pretending. Truth. And sometimes, when truth finally enters the room, the future begins changing in ways no one saw coming.